Thank you so much, Volker. Thank you for having me, really. I think this is a great format for these talks. Not only just to have a little bit of interaction also with a wide array of stakeholders in the field, but also, of course, because then these are recorded and can be widely circulated to diffuse knowledge a little bit. So, as Volker was already saying, my name is Vander Maelen. I'm a legal officer at the European Commission at DG Connect, and DG Connect is essentially our digital policy department at the Commission. Now, I'm part of the Digital Services Act team, and the Digital Services Act, I'll obviously explain it a little bit in a second, is a new landmark piece of legislation. And since I'm working on some more specific articles, we thought it would be very interesting to share with you a little bit more insights onto these perhaps somewhat lesser known articles of the DSA. So I've shared my screen. I unfortunately don't see anything else. So I'm a bit reliant on you to tell me if, for example, the sound is bad or you can't see me or you can't see the presentation or something. So, by all means, do tell me if this would be the case. If there are no technical comments or so, then I suggest that we get right to it and really, So basically, I've structured this to encompass three large parts. First of all, a very basic introduction into the DSA, because the goal of this talk is not to give you an overall view of the DSA. The goal is to do a deep dive into Articles 44 through 48. So, I'll just set the scene a little bit as to what the DSA does so you can better understand why Articles 44 and 48 are interesting. But if you want a general explanation on the DSA and its many interesting provisions, this might not be quite the presentation you're looking for. Just FYI, to save yourself some time if you're looking for that. Now, when we get to Articles 44 through 48, we're going to be talking about the three different instruments that are encompassed in that, essentially. There's standards under Article 44. There's my beloved codes of conduct. As you may know, my nickname in some circles is Carl of Conduct. So, I love talking about these instruments. And then finally, there's crisis protocols. So I'll be talking about these three for, I would say, most of the presentation before, of course, landing on a brief conclusion. And in that conclusion, we can, set the scene also a little bit maybe for the Q&A afterwards, if there would be any questions from anyone. So, okay, very, very brief explanation on what the DSA is exactly, just so that you understand a bit more my background on Articles 44 through 48. So the DSA tries to create a safe, predictable, and trusted digital space. It is the EU's new piece of landmark legislation that deals with online safety, essentially. And it does this by protecting the fundamental rights of users online, but also by establishing a level playing field for businesses and the internal market in general, and harmonizing obligations and establishing a framework. So by doing this, by setting these very ambitious goals, if we're being honest, the DSA tries to be a very comprehensive piece of legislation that covers many elements that are very much in the limelight right now. Whether that's the protection of users online, whether it's the protection of minors specifically, whether that's dark patterns when you're shopping online, whether that's potentially illegal goods on online marketplaces, you name it. There's a lot to discuss. Again, like I said, I'm just going to be treating you to the very, very basics that we need to better understand 44 through 48 of the DSA. Now, there are three main actors involved in the governance of supervising digital services under the DSA. The first one are the Digital Services Coordinators, or DSCs, as they're called. These are essentially independent national authorities who perform direct supervision and enforcement of the DSA's rules to platforms with less than 45 million monthly users in the EU. So this is a very critical distinction to keep in mind, that a platform has less than 45 million monthly users. If it has more, it's the European Commission who does the supervision and enforcement, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, the Digital Services Coordinators, as we see in the member states, this can be a wide variety of authorities. For example, there are competition authorities who have been appointed as the DSC. There have also been telecommunications authorities, etc. So really, it's a wide gamut of authorities, but essentially, it's mostly those who have a bit of experience in dealing with digital technologies. That's, I think, broadly speaking, a bit the through line when looking at the different types of DSCs out there. Now, these DSCs actually get together also in the so-called European Board for Digital Services, or in common parlance, as we often say, the DSA board. So this board is chaired by the Commission, and what it essentially does is provide advice, both to the DSCs and to the Commission, and it issues recommendations. There's a whole range of specific tasks here. For example, there's recommendations when it comes to codes of conduct or standards. There's assistance when it comes to certain investigations. I'm not going to go into this much deeper, but essentially you could do an entire other presentation just on the role of the board. It's very multifaceted. It does very important work, and it's a very, very important actor in the overall DSA ecosystem, especially because they're also the ones who help with the consistent application of the DSA across all member states. The DSA, as a regulation, of course, does not leave much room for individual interpretations on national law. It is very much meant to be applied in a uniform manner across the EU, and that's why the European Board of Digital Services is so important. Then finally, the third actor in this whole ecosystem is the European Commission itself, which I'm obviously representing also today, and I'll be speaking mostly, of course, from our angle as the Commission. So the Commission is responsible for the direct enforcement of the DSA vis-a-vis so-called very large online platforms and search engines, or VLOPs, as we sometimes also call them. I'll tell you a little bit more about what makes a platform a very large online platform in the next slide, but essentially here's this distinction I was mentioning earlier. If a platform has more than 45 million monthly users, it's the European Commission that does the supervision and enforcement. If it has less than 45 million monthly users, it's the national authorities by way of digital services coordinators. So the Commission, besides its supervision and enforcement, also advises on cross-border disputes, and also it intervenes if DSCs have certain requests. So these are, broadly speaking, the three major actors involved in the governance of the DSA. As you can see, they all very much clearly have their package of tasks, even though there are also very many interactions between all of them. And especially the board is where both the DSCs and the Commission intersect very clearly and cooperate in a very constructive way. So now here comes the big one, right? Who does the DSA apply to exactly? And this is one of the biggest innovations of the DSA. It very much takes into account the size of a certain service. So the general philosophy is that the bigger a service is, the more obligations it should follow. And vice versa, of course, the smaller a service is, or the less functionalities it has, the less obligations and burdens it should take on. So the DSA in general applies to so-called online intermediaries. This is a huge, huge array of specific services. For example, there's internet access providers, domain name registries, etc. Like really so incredibly many things fall under this. And basically, these are the ones that all of the obligations of the DSA apply to. Now, if we go a little bit narrower, and we look in terms of functionality, if we look at intermediaries that are hosting services, think of cloud services, for example, web hosting services, etc., then the circle becomes a bit narrower. And there's more specific obligations in play for these specific actors. For example, the notice and action mechanism, of which I'll tell you a bit more later. If we go even more specific and we go on online platforms, so, think of social network sites that we use, such as Facebook or Instagram. Think about online marketplaces, such as Temu and Shein, or app stores, the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. These are so-called online platforms. These have somewhat more obligations still. And then finally, we arrive at that yellow core there, the very large online platforms, the VLOPs, and the very large online search engines, the VLOSs. These are the ones that have over 45 million monthly users in the EU, and they are the ones who have the most stringent obligations basically attached to them because of their size, because of their unique functionalities, and maybe even more importantly, because of the specific risks that we as a European Commission see in this regard. So, okay. Here we go, essentially with the circle. I hope this makes it a bit clear and visualizes it a bit nicely to all of you, how this essentially works. This is the basic overview of the DSA. Now, you can see that underneath these examples of which intermediaries there are, I also provided some illustrations of the kinds of obligations. This is really just from an illustratory perspective. But so, for example, for intermediaries, all intermediaries need to provide certain information in their terms and conditions under Article 14 of the DSA. That's the part on the right side of the presentation that you could see. Now, this is obviously a very basic obligation, if you will, and it's expected of all intermediaries. But then if you go up in that rank, you see more specific obligations, such as the notice and action mechanism. Essentially, this means if a user sees a piece of content that they believe is either violating terms and conditions or perhaps really violating certain laws, then they should be able to notify the service of this, and action should be undertaken. So Article 16 of the DSA. For online platforms, there's even more specific obligations, such as having an internal complaint handling system, meaning that they need to be able to respond to users also in case something happens to their content, and to respond also when that user protests against it. And then finally, for the VLOPs and the VLOCs, there's the most stringent obligations. And, there's many that are very interesting to discuss today, but I want to single out auditing in particular, because this is really a very hefty process, of course, where all of the obligations that a VLOP or a VLOS has under the DSA need to be audited by an independent third party. So this is quite a stringent obligation, and you can understand why the European legislator only wants to put this on the very biggest platforms who also have the money and the resources to actually go through this obligation. In that regard, the DSA learns quite a lot of lessons from some of the other instruments, such as, for example, the GDPR, which did a little bit less of, a sorting or distinguishing between certain companies of certain sizes. So this is a super interesting way of approaching it. And if you're a bit familiar with the Artificial Intelligence Act, you may have noticed that this act also takes some inspiration from how the DSA is set up. Okay. That was enough of that. What we really now need to focus on a little bit is what the VLOPs and the VLOSs have to do under the DSA. And the, shall I say, marquee obligation here is that they have to perform annual risk assessments and also risk mitigation that they have to perform. Basically, they need to identify, analyze, and assess systemic risks that stem from the design or the functioning or the use made of their services. This can be many, many different things, and I'll walk you through it a little bit. So first of all, they have to do it at least once a year, and before they deploy any functionality that they think might have a critical impact. It's a bit an assessment on a case-by-case basis, but for example, when TikTok introduced a reward system where people were being rewarded for watching a lot of content and interacting with a lot of content, you should be thinking that this might, in fact, indeed have a critical impact on users and on the systemic risks that we'll discuss on the next slide. So how should they exactly perform this risk assessment? Well, with Diligence, they should look specifically for their service, and there should also be proportionality to the systemic risks, and they need to consider the severity and the probability that something would go wrong or that there is a risk. They need to base themselves on the best available information, on scientific insights, and they also need to involve the groups that are most impacted and also test with them. It's here, of course, that many of our partners in this broader online safety dialogue are very relevant. We rely very much also on indications from researchers. There's very much also an interest in hearing what NGOs have to say about all of this. So, this kind of evidence that is gathered by these other actors is very, very, very relevant when considering the overall risk assessment that VLOPs and VLOSs have to carry out under the DSA. Now, they need to also have mitigation measures in place, risk mitigation measures, and these need to be reasonable, proportionate, and effective. They need to be tailored to specific systemic risks, and they need to have a consideration on the fundamental rights impact. Now, you might think so far that I've stayed a little bit on the surface, a little bit vague about these so-called systemic risks, and you're right. It's because, of course, there's an entire slide dedicated to it because it is such an important part of the DSA and its architecture. Essentially, what we're interested in is looking at systemic risks in the Union. And there are certain risk factors at play, such as algorithms or how a platform organizes its content moderation, how it organizes its terms and conditions, etc. that ultimately lead to four big categories of systemic risks that we see. The first one is illegal content. And I think this is probably one of the most easy ones to imagine something. If you see products circulating online, such as firearms, and your country does not allow firearms to be sold online, then this is very clearly a dissemination of illegal content, especially if this would, for example, happen through vendors that don't have like a clear license or so. So, okay, illegal content. This can also, of course, encompass other like very typical pieces of very clearly manifestly illegal content, such as, for example, child sexual abuse material. So, okay, I think when it comes to illegal content, you can probably pretty clearly picture something. But a second one is also if there's a negative impact on fundamental rights. And of course, the Charter of the European Union and its fundamental rights has many, many, many different ones at play. But there's specific attention in the DSA ecosystem for the freedom of expression, for human dignity, for private and family life, for personal data, also harkening back a little bit to the GDPR. So in general, the DSA tries to look out for any sort of impact that it can have on the fundamental rights of people who are in the union. Now, a third one, and this is where it gets, I would say, the most interesting for people with a legal/political background, is if there is an impact on civic discourse and electoral processes. As you may know, about 10 years ago or so, in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, we were suddenly being confronted with the idea that online platforms can be misused by certain malicious actors, that they can use the architecture of these platforms to influence how people think, how people act, and how people vote. And it's in the wake of that that the DSA tries to very clearly tackle that by recognizing an impact on civic discourse and an electoral process as a particular negative effect that should be taken into account. So we see a lot of attention for this in the DSA's life cycle so far, and I think you'll keep seeing a lot of attention for this because it is, of course, such a previously more ethereal concept that now has been made very concrete. And then finally, there is a negative impact on gender, minors, public effects. Negative effects in relation to gender-based violence, the protection of public health and minors, etc. And you know probably just as well as I that right now, all these discussions, especially on the protection of minors, are really gaining traction in our union and are very much like driving a political will to take some action soon. But I want you to know, essentially, that the DSA does provide very valuable tools to already do something about that. So these are the four big categories of systemic risks. And within these, there's multiple subcategories, but we won't focus on that much more. The most important thing to remember right now is essentially that the DSA has this very innovative architecture of looking at systemic risks, of treating services as a potential risk vector for some of these elements to manifest themselves. So now we'll get to a bit more, instead of the general part on the DSA, we'll go to a bit more of a specific angle here. And the specific angle is Articles 44, 48. I assume that if you're watching this, you're doing it because you have a particular interest in these articles, which have remained a bit underexplored and a bit underdiscussed. Have no fear. I'm here to do exactly that. I work on all these articles within the commission team, and I find them endlessly intriguing. My main hope is, of course, that after you watch this and listen to me, you also find them endlessly intriguing. Let's find out, shall we? The first one is Article 44, which deals with standards. And this is already quite a tricky one to begin with, because essentially what it posits in this article is that an effective and consistent application of the obligations found in the DSA can be reached when implementing them through technological means that can support intermediary services in their compliance with the DSA. What a mouthful, I know. Let's try and break it down a little bit. What actually is involved here? Well, we're talking about standards that should be set by the relevant European and international standardization bodies. This is, for example, ISO, the International Standardization Organization. Or on a European level, you might be familiar with CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI. If these acronyms mean nothing to you, no worries. Just read up a little bit on standardization. You won't need it for much more in this talk. What I mostly want to focus on is how, of course, this interplays with intermediary services and how it can be of use of them. And this is essentially what I was saying earlier already. There's this idea that by developing standards, it can contribute to the effective and the consistent application of the DSA. The reasoning being here that standards are developed by a wide array of stakeholders. There's the standardization bodies themselves, of course, but there's also companies involved that are actively involved in the design of these standards. There's also sometimes civil society organizations involved, industry associations, you name it, and European Commission often is also involved in this process. The idea being that if this group of stakeholders works together to find a standard in the end, a technological kind of way of approaching the DSA's obligations, that this can greatly help with making sure there's just one standard that everybody can use and then in a consistent way interpret the DSA. So that's basically the real added value of standards. Now, standards typically cover more technical procedures. And you see this in the DSA as well, that it tries to put forward some of the more technical parts of the DSA. But regardless, of course, we can't escape the reality that the DSA in the end is a very principles-based kind of piece of legislation. You know, it's not a technical piece of legislation necessarily. It contains principles. It contains more qualitative judgment rather than quantitative judgment. So it does take some thinking on how exactly you can incorporate standards in this overall ecosystem. Now, it's important to emphasize that standards are voluntary in nature. They usually are. It's only in some specific fields where standards are very, very obligatory, but that's not the case, to be clear, here in the DSA. They're very much voluntary tools that companies can be involved in to make, hopefully, their lives easier and ensure a more consistent application of the DSA. But a very important one is to stress that there is no presumption of compliance. In some fields, if you follow a standard, there is a so-called presumption of compliance that until found otherwise, you as a company are presumed to be complying with the legislation. That's not the case in the DSA. It's very explicit about that. And it does also mean that the incentive to be involved in standards becomes a bit more difficult. Something for you to consider what you think about this. And very happy to discuss this further also in the Q&A if you'd be so inclined. Now, like as I was saying, a lot of times standards deal with more technical elements, and the DSA does sort of put forward some technical parts of it, although it's always mixed with this qualitative element, such as the notice and action mechanism that I was already explaining earlier, where as a user, you should be able to notify a platform or, any sort of intermediary service of a piece of content that you think might not belong there. So maybe there could be a standardized solution on how such a notice and action mechanism should work, what it looks like for the user. Because of course, you can clearly see there would be a benefit for users if on every intermediary service they use, they would have the same procedure. Makes it very easy, very streamlined for them to do this. Then there's, for example, also notices by trusted flaggers. I'm not going to go into this much more in detail. The same with the interoperability of ad repositories. These are quite important DSA obligations. All that I just want to emphasize here is that essentially standardization can be a way to make these important DSA obligations occur in a more consistent and perhaps in a more streamlined manner, both for companies involved and for users. Now, I want to push back a little bit on what I sometimes see in some discourse among other stakeholders, and there's definitely some terminological conflation going on. A lot of people tend to use terms such as standards or guidelines or best practices in a sort of interchangeable way, but just beware that this is important, that we call things by what they are supposed to be. Standards under Article 44 are not at all the same thing as guidelines. Guidelines are documents published by the Commission, where essentially it says how it is going to interpret the DSA in our case. So this is a very, very different thing from a standard, which is an instrument that is developed by a group of stakeholders together in a standardization body. So please do not get these mixed up. Same with best practices. The DSA actually has some specific references to best practices also in risk mitigation measures. This is not at all the same as standards. So, just for the sake of all speaking the same language and knowing where we stand, it's important to draw a distinction here. Now, I mentioned earlier that the board, our beloved DSA board, also plays some important role in the implementation of the DSA. And here in standards, that's very much the case. For example, the board is supposed to support and promote their development and their implementation, including by issuing opinions and recommendations on them. Now, at the moment, there are no standards yet under the DSA. As a result, there's also no material by the board yet. So, not to worry in this regard. You haven't missed anything if you think that you should have seen this pass by. And then a final one is also to draw a bit of a distinction between standards in the DSA and in the Artificial Intelligence Act. Like I said, the AI Act in some ways draws a lot of lessons from the DSA, but it treats standards very differently. Because in the AI Act, certain standards do lead to a presumption of compliance with the Act, which is, of course, a huge incentive for a company to be involved, and of course also makes it very critical that a standard adheres very closely to the point of the AI Act. So, let's definitely not confuse how these types of standards are used, because they're very different across both of these instruments. Sorry, I'm sometimes also checking the chat. So if you see a little black box appear, no worries, your screen is not glitching. It's just me taking a look. Okay, so as I was saying, I'm sometimes also known as Carl of Conduct. So yes, of course, I have to talk about codes of conduct at some point. I was even doubting whether I should wear my Carl of Conduct t-shirt, but I thought, let's not push it too far. So here I am in my humble gray while melting a little bit in the Belgian sweltering heat, here to talk to you about codes of conduct. So codes of conduct occupy not one, not two, but a full 3 articles within the DSA, which is marvelous. It means there's a lot for us to dig in. However, also in the interest of your sanity, I'm going to try and keep it a bit streamlined and a bit short where possible. Because essentially, all of these articles are quite different. And Article 45, though, is the big one. Article 45 is the mastodon that you should be focusing on the most, because this is the one where it stipulates that the Commission and the Board shall encourage and facilitate voluntary codes of conduct to tackle specific challenges of different types of illegal content and systemic risks. This is where you can very clearly see that codes of conduct harken back to the whole systemic risk and risk mitigation system that I was discussing earlier, which is so fundamental and so central to the architecture of the DSA. So by having voluntary tools starting to interact with the mandatory nature of risk assessment and risk mitigation, you land in a very, very interesting construction from a legal perspective, but more on that in a second. Now, participation to a code of conduct is open to relevant stakeholders, and this can vary wildly between different codes. For example, there's certain codes of conduct that are only open to platforms. There's other ones where not only platforms, but also, for example, fact-checking organizations or civil society organizations are part of the signatory base. So, you can see quite some variety in there, and every code is unique, and that's what makes them so beautiful. Now, for very large online platforms and search engines, there is a real incentive to be involved in such codes of conduct. And it's because if they adhere to them and comply with them, then they may be considered a risk mitigation measure under the DSA. This is, of course, quite an attractive proposition. By following this voluntary instrument that you can also kind of influence as a company or as a trade association, etc., you might actually be entitled to have a risk mitigation measure to fall back on, which creates like a very, very beautiful opportunity to show to us as the regulator some best efforts in trying to tackle different types of legal content and systemic risks. Now, the most important thing for a code of conduct is that it should always contribute to the proper application of the DSA, that it should clearly set out its specific objectives, that it should contain KPIs, key performance indicators, and that it should also take into account the needs and interests of all interested parties. Now, I know that all of this sounds a bit cut and dry, but all of this is really, really important for us to make our assessment. More on that in a second later. And if you ever take a look at the Commission opinions on our approved codes of conduct, you can see that these 4 criteria basically form the beating heart of determining whether or not a draft code of conduct can be considered a code under Article 45 of the DSA. Like I was saying, this recognition is important. The fact that there's a positive assessment by the Commission and the board following these criteria. If they are then recognized as a code under Article 45, they could be used as a risk mitigation measure, and they could also be used as a remedy in case there are infringements of the DSA. It's a bit technical. I won't go much deeper into detail on this, but please do read Article 75 of the DSA if you're interested. Now, the Commission maintains a power of discretion, though, in checking whether or not a company really is using a code of conduct in a good faith way and if it can be used as a risk mitigation measure. It's also interesting to note that the company's internal compliance function and compliance officers also need to check whether a company really is following its commitments under a code of conduct. And these codes of conduct also need to be audited, which is quite interesting. And again, makes it clear that there is a link between this as a voluntary nature and also a bit more of the harder obligations that exist under the DSA. Now we have 2 approved codes of conduct at the moment under Article 45, and the first one is a code of conduct on countering illegal hate speech online. So it was initially an initiative in 2016, not DG Connect in the lead, but actually DG Just, our department that deals with justice and consumer affairs. And it has 12 signatories, of which there are also 5 VLOPs. It's Facebook, Instagram, 7, I believe. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, YouTube, X, and Snapchat. Yes, X is still part of this code of conduct, by the way. So recently, I guess I should say, time goes so fast. It's already previous, like last year, but I would still call it previously. We also carried out a revision of this code of conduct to better make it align with the DSA so that it could be integrated into the DSA framework, could interact with the systemic risks, could interact with the risk mitigation measure framework. And this happened in January last year. Now, it's very important for you to know that illegal hate speech under this code is not actually defined in the code itself. It follows national laws, just as the DSA does itself as well, by the way. It's a transposition of the so-called 2008 framework decision, which mostly deals with xenophobia, but also other provisions such as national provisions. For example, if there is a member state that has also criminalized other kinds of hate speech, so for example, maybe gender-based violence, then this is also taken into account. It's not the DSA that determines what is hate speech. It's not the code of conduct that determines what is hate speech. It's national legislation. And I find this very important to emphasize because sometimes we hear very bizarre criticism that we as the Commission would be imposing our view on what is acceptable speech or not, when this is absolutely not the case. In fact, we always refer to national legislation. So, just a little side note to mention here. Now, the marquee part of this code of conduct on hate speech is its so-called annual monitoring exercise, where the signatories commit to review at least 50% of their notices under Article 16, notice and action in the DSA, and 22, which is the trusted flaggers provision, within 24 hours. And these have to come from so-called monitoring reporters, which are organizations with expertise that are also chosen by the signatories of the code to fulfill this role. So this is really an interesting exercise, and we've somewhat recently concluded our first one under the revised Code of Conduct, generally showing that the platforms do take their commitments quite seriously, and at the very least are quite able to review the majority of their notices within the 24-hour time frame, although certainly not perfect, and certainly we still have some extra elements we want to talk about, definitely when looking at next year and the way that it can be incorporated further. Then there's a code of conduct on disinformation, which is the other approved code of conduct. This is initially from 2018 and is actually led by DG Connect. It has a very broad community of signatories, a bit like I was mentioning earlier. So, there's online platforms, search engines, but also the advertising industry, fact checkers, researchers. It's a really, really interesting broad community of people who are involved in the whole disinformation loop, basically. It was strengthened in 2022. and then integrated last year in February into the DSA framework. And this, again, allows it to become part of this whole ecosystem where there is risk assessments being carried out, where there's risk mitigation measures, and the code of conduct can also be one of those risk mitigation measures. Now, the code is quite large. It contains a very robust set of commitments to address all systemic risks related to disinformation. So, for example, fact-checking is explicitly mentioned as an effective approach. There's also some strategies on demonetizing disinformation, etc. And then there's also the so-called rapid response system, which is another very, very successful part of the code, which allows for rapid communication, cooperation, and coordination in times of elections. And this has been activated many times to great success, and really we see provides usefulness on the ground and in the field. There's also so-called codes of conduct for online advertising. Now, these are voluntary codes, just as Article 45 was, by the way, and the Commission here has a mandate to encourage and facilitate the development of such a code for online advertising. The main point of this is to encourage further transparency for actors that are involved in the online advertising value chain, beyond the transparency that is already put forward by the DSA. It essentially tries to achieve a more effective transmission of info to achieve a competitive, transparent, and fair environment. And so I think like this, it also links up very beautifully with many of our current priorities on simplification, on competitiveness for the European Union. And a broad array of stakeholders are mentioned here, not just platforms and not just intermediary services or civil society organizations, but also other actors in the programmatic advertising value chain or organizations representing recipients. So this is a really, really interesting provision. There is at the moment no code for online advertising, but the Commission has taken steps to encourage and facilitate. But of course, we're always open to dialogue with partners. And so if we hear from stakeholders that there is an interest in this, then of course, we are very happy to be in dialogue. Now, the last one is Article 47, Code of Conduct on Accessibility. There is not that much to say at the moment. The main goal of this is to promote the full and effective equal participation by improving access to online services, especially for persons with disabilities. And this is, of course, a very, very broad array of people, because we do need to look a bit beyond our stereotypical view of disabilities. Disabilities is not only physical disabilities. It is not only having a physical impediment to using a service, for example, a visual impairment. It can also be mental impairments. And this is something that is insufficiently discussed at the moment, I believe, in the whole online accessibility debate. Whether that's people who have a mental impediments, for example, whether that's Down syndrome or so, but also, for example, people of older ages who now might also start facing a little bit more issues when navigating the online environment. And so I think it's very important that we look at accessibility online in a more holistic and more broad spectrum than we have been doing so far. There's the Web Accessibility Directive already. There's the European Accessibility Act, which entered into force not that long ago and is really, really a paradigm shift on how accessibility is treated in the EU. But of course, there's always room for improvement. And this article of the DSA definitely also allows for some further action if that would be interesting and desirable. Now, I'm starting to wrap up a little bit because I also know that we still want some time for a Q&A session. But the final one I want to highlight is crisis protocols under Article 48, which is a very, very interesting provision, if you ask me, because these are voluntary protocols to coordinate a rapid, collective, and cross-border response if there are crisis situations. Now, we need to be very clear here. There are two important terms: incidents, which can cover a broad array of situations, and crises. And crises under the DSA are very specific. These are only extraordinary circumstances affecting public security or public health. So it is really, really a tiny, tiny subset of situations. And if all goes well, hopefully we don't even have any crises in the term of the DSA in the coming years. So, fingers crossed. It's a very, very, very narrow, specifically meant to be very narrow kind of interpretation and term. Now, who can be involved in this? Well, the very large online platforms are, again, a bit the usual suspects here, but also other online platforms or other online search engines to allow as much coordination as possible in case there is a crisis. For the very large online platforms and search engines, if they follow such a crisis protocol, it could also be a risk mitigation measure, again, linking with the architecture of the DSA. Now, such a protocol can only be for a limited period of time, and the measures need to be limited to what is strictly necessary to address the extraordinary circumstance. In general, there's no general obligation to monitor information that is transmitted or stored by providers or to actively seek facts or circumstances. This, again, is also linking up to the DSA's general mission, which says that there is no general monitoring. Finally, the board is the one who may recommend that the commission initiates their drawing up, although I think there is some flexibility in how this occurs exactly. But the most important thing is to note that they are voluntary tools and that this especially distinguishes them from Article 36 DSA, which note the commission can also impose certain measures in case of a crisis. But that's, to be clear, not the case here in Article 48. And then if there is a protocol under 48, it needs to have one or more of the following, such as, prominently displaying info on crises, specific points of contact, or adapting resources that are otherwise used. So these are all things that quite make sense. And then basically, these protocols also need to include all of those other following criteria, which I'm not going to read to you right now. Please take a look at Article 48, I'd say. It's just very interesting to know how such a protocol should be constructed exactly and what it can do exactly. So this leads me a little bit to the ending, basically. And I want to end by saying that the DSA is a very innovative instrument. And as a lawyer myself, I find it very, very nice to work on this instrument because it is so innovative, because it has so many cool elements to it. This focus on systemic risks is really a very, very different approach that we hadn't seen before in other pieces of legislation. And the DSA really offers a very comprehensive toolbox, whether that's trusted flaggers, whether that's the notice and action mechanism, whether that's auditing, or whether that's also just how everything in general interacts with each other and links back to that crucial risk assessment and risk mitigation measure system. Articles 44 and 48, as I hope you understand after this presentation, aim to further aid the implementation of the DSA. They basically try to operationalize the obligations that exist under the DSA in a very clear-cut manner for the companies involved specifically. And the interactions that exist between Articles 45, so Code of Conduct, and 48, Crisis Protocols, and the risk framework in particular, really opens the door for companies to be involved in a very useful manner. So that concludes it. I hope you found this interesting. I know that all of this is a little bit more niche compared to some of the very big famous obligations of the DSA, but I think that we should definitely have some attention for Articles 44, 48, so that also everybody can be a bit better involved in this. And we very much also suggest that you reach out to us as a commission if you're interested in learning more about these or interested in being involved in any of these articles. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to a very nice Q&A now. Thank you.